let's talk about what an API is, or an application programming interface.
Yeah, and the two key words here are these days are application and interface. The programming has an etymology that started in development and came from the days of where APIs were a lot more often used between code bases. So for example, the interface in Java. Nowadays, when we think API, we're thinking modern APIs. We think HTTP APIs, endpoints that you talk to get information from, which we'll talk more about later. But in its essence, an API is usually a software layer, and it provides an interface with which an application or a host can talk to a server, which is usually backed by a database. It's well-defined and structured, and I have in quotes here contract. Really what I mean is there's a set list of things that you can query, do, read, write, and that's it. So just because the server behind the API has a lot more functionality doesn't mean you have access to it. The API is a well-defined contract that says what you can and cannot do.
At least if it's a well-defined API.
Right. So I included this slide just to kind of to give you an idea of what it might look like. And this is an API over HTTP. So in this example, in the request, everybody will recognize that looks like a website. I'm going to a website. In most cases, that's what an API endpoint is. It's something that you can go to via the web, right? So in this particular case, we're looking at /homes limit equals 5. Those are the parameters that you're sending the API when you go to that server. And then if the API recognizes it, it's going to respond. And that response has, in this case, just text. In the internet, when you go to a website, it's displaying human digestible content, right? It looks pretty. It has a presentation layer. What we're talking about is it's just throwing data back at you. So an API can be thought of in that way. An API at its core is just a way to interface with an application that is well-defined and structured.
And these are some examples of some commonly used APIs, because a lot of people will say, I don't use APIs. You do, you just don't realize it. Social media APIs. So, when you read a news story, there will often be a little bird and the Facebook icon. That means that you can share those to Twitter and Facebook respectively. And there are other icons as well. Some will have email, so that you can share the story. That's all API. It's an application interface to let your news story interact with Twitter, with Facebook. Login and authentication APIs, which we all use all the time.
And I bolded for a reason we'll get back to after we go through the list.
Right. Widget and service APIs, financial and payment APIs, banking APIs were the #1 target of hackers. They're not anymore because they can make more money directly by stealing from you instead of stealing from your bank to steal from you. But they are still a thing. Travel and booking APIs, content delivery and management, and then microservices, which we do see.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I highlighted login and authentication APIs is the key here is, in this particular case, this API's sole purpose is to get some sort of token. You authenticate through the API, and then you receive a token, and that token has privileges.
And an example of that might be if you use Google or Facebook to sign on to another account. For example, my newspaper subscription, I use Google to sign into, and that's using Google's login API.
You may also have an application that your IT team uses, and in order to have access to that application, you might have to log in through Active Directory and get a privilege token from that service, and then that token allows you to access, because it has roles and privileges attached to it, allows you to access the application. If you don't have the token, you can't use the application. So the reason we want to highlight login and authentication is sometimes those tokens have a lot more rights than folks intend. And what are the consequences of that?
And we'll get into that in a bit